All right, so we're going to go through a quick workshop on the SWF, the workload assignment process, which includes the standard workload form, your SWF, that details all of the work that you've been assigned during a SWFted period. I'm Neil McNair, the Chief Steward and Communications Officer for OPSU Local 653 at Northern College. And at this time of year, we are receiving our workloads for the winter semester. It is very important that we take the time to review this workload as assigned by our supervisors and make sure that the SWF that we receive is accurate and reflects the actual workload that we're being asked to do. So today the emphasis is on the facts. It is on the process for assigning workload. It is on the factors that go into calculating your total workload as shown on the standard workload form, what we call the SWF. It should give you the tools and the knowledge to properly review your SWF and ensure its accuracy. And it will give you some guidelines as to what to do if you do not agree with your SWF. Now, it's just the facts because we're not covering some of the more controversial aspects of Article 11 of the workload assignment process. We're really focused on this process that we're going through at this time of the year of the workload assignment. So Article 11 is a long article, the longest one in the collective agreement. As you might expect, it deals with how we're assigned workload. It is not only about the SWF. It covers far more than just the standard workload form. However, that is our focus today. So here are a few of the main areas. 1101, 1102 deals with dispute resolution. 1108 covers non-teaching periods. 1109, modified workload agreements. But our concern today, again, is really focused on Article 1101, which details some of these core elements of the workload assignment process. So when you look at the language in 1101, if you've spent any time reading other parts of the collective agreement and then you get into Article 11, you may notice right away this change in the language as it's presented. You will notice that there is far more emphasis on the individual and their supervisor, so the individual faculty member, and the language that's used throughout this article is about consultation, discussion, agreement. So it really emphasizes the fact that the SWF process, the workload assignment process, really does involve a negotiation between you as a faculty member and your supervisor. And that's why it's all the more incumbent on you to understand this process and to understand what goes into calculating your workload so that you can be a knowledgeable participant in this process. So the process, the big picture view is that the workload has to be discussed between you and your manager before any official assignment of a SWF document or a workload document is presented to you. So you have to have some sort of meeting with your supervisor. Following that meeting, you need to receive your official SWF document, which we will see pictures of, although I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with it by now. And this must be received or assigned to you no later than 6 weeks before the beginning of the SWF period that's detailed by that form. And that, of course, does not include scheduled vacation time. Once you receive your SWF, you have 5 days to review it and either accept the assigned workload by signing and returning it back to your supervisor, or if you have doubts or questions about the SWF, you can refer it to the workload monitoring group for review. After 5 days, if you don't respond, if you do nothing, then the SWF is deemed to be accepted by you, and that will be your workload for the coming semester. So the assigned workload, when we talk about this, there is a difference between workload periods where you have assigned work and where you do not have assigned work. And really, you can think of this as whether you have an active SWF or you do not have an active SWF. So this SWF, the assigned workload, deals with work that is specifically assigned to you and attributed, documented on this standard workload form. So this workload is usually tied to courses. That's usually the foundation of the SWF, is some teaching that you're going to be doing. And then there are additional duties that may be assigned on top of that. So the SWF itself, again, here's a shot of what the SWF document looks like at Northern College. That SWF stands for Standard Workload Form, and this is what's used to detail all the assigned work that you are given. All full-time faculty and only full-time faculty are given a SWF when assigned any teaching contact hours during the academic year. Now, we'll start off with where Article 1101 starts off, which is defining some general limits to workload. So the base limit is 44 hours in any week. That is the maximum that you're supposed to be assigned in a week as detailed on the SWF. If you teach in a post-secondary program, which the majority do, but there are also non-post-secondary programs, then the maximum number of weeks where you may be assigned work, where you may have an active SWF, is 36 weeks. For non-post-secondary, that limit is 2 weeks longer, so you have up to 38 weeks where you may be working under a SWF. So the calculation of your workload, the total attribution of your workload, takes into consideration a number of factors, and we're going to deal with each one of these on their own. So the first one is teaching contact hours, and what that means is a college scheduled contact hour assigned to you by the college. So this usually corresponds, or this should absolutely correspond to the time that shows up on your official timetable as given to you by the college. And a teaching contact hour is defined by the number of hours that the course may have, or that how it's defined in the program synopsis for that program. Now, a teaching contact hour does not depend on the delivery mode, and this language is explicitly stated in 1101, regardless of the delivery mode, whether it's in person, by video, online, fully online, courses shall be deemed to have the same number of teaching contact hours. And all this means is that we do not change. If a course is 3 hours per week, it does not become 4 hours per week because you're asked to deliver it by video or through online delivery. Now, the number of teaching contact hours per week is set in the program pathway document. This is not something that you can negotiate with your supervisor at the SWF time. Those number of hours per week per course are defined, and although they can change, it's not through the SWF process that you're going to be changing the number of hours per week for a course. Now, there are some limits defined in 1101. The total number of teaching contact hours per week that can be assigned to you if you're teaching in post-secondary is 18 hours per week. Okay? If you're teaching in non-post-secondary, then the maximum number of teaching contact hours you can be given is 20 per week. So, since you can't really negotiate the number of teaching contact hours, what should you be doing in terms of checking the accuracy of your SWF when it comes to teaching contact hours? Well, certainly you want to make sure that the number of hours showing on your SWF actually represents what each one of those courses is supposed to have according to the program pathway. And you need to make sure that your total contact hours are not exceeded. So on the SWF document itself, you will see that the hours per course are listed. You will have each course listed as its own section or preparation. And there is a section here for hours that detail the number of hours for that course. Now, in some cases, in this particular case, there is a course that is split up with labs. So there's a 2-hour lab that's split into sections and a 1-hour common period. In total, this course is 3 hours, but on the SWF, it's broken down and actually takes up 5 contact hours because for parts of the course, the group is split. As long as the total contact hours add up properly based on the sections and preparations that you're assigned, you should be fine. The next factor that comes into play is attributed hours for preparation. So we all know you can't just show up and teach a course without preparing for it. You have to put in time preparing your materials, preparing your lessons, preparing everything that you're going to be doing with your students. So the standard workload form takes this into consideration and has a set formula for attributing the amount of prep that you have to do. So they do this by assigning a type of course, and this is generally associated with your familiarity with the course itself, which makes sense. So in other words, the first time you teach a course, it is assumed that you're going to have to spend more time preparing and familiarizing yourself with the course materials and course content, as opposed to when you're teaching that course for the 10th time in the past 4 or 5 years. So these course types have these different categories of new, established, repeat, and they are to recognize that based on your particular situation, familiarity with that course, or whether or not you're repeating a second section of that same course on a single SWF, the amount of prep time that you're attributed will go down according to how familiar you are with the material for that course. So preparation is calculated only based on the teaching contact hours and this prep factor, which is calculated based on the type of the course. The number of students do not factor into the prep time, which makes sense because whether you have 2 students in a class or 20 or 200, you're essentially preparing the same materials for presenting regardless of the number of students in the class. So the highest attribution is associated with a new prep type. And this is fairly simple to understand, at least the first part of it. A course is new to you if you have never taught it before, which makes sense. And in that case, you'll be given 1.1 hours per teaching contact hour for that course. The other category here, or criteria that can determine a new course, is if you are teaching it since a major revision to the course or curriculum. So in other words, you've taught this course before, but now there's been a big change to the course, to the course itself or the curriculum. So that is an area that can lead to some dispute and disagreement. So you may feel that a change to the course has been very significant and warrants a new attribution. Your supervisor may feel differently. So this is an area where you may find yourself needing to go to workload resolution in order to resolve this dispute, or you may be able to come to an agreement with your supervisor about the attribution that should go with this course. If you get a new attribution for a course, this is how the factor works out. For every teaching contact hour, you are given 1.1 hours of prep time per week for that course. So for a 3-hour course, 3 teaching contact hours, you would end up with 3.3 preparation hours per week for a course that's categorized as new. An established A course is a course that you've taught before, but not within the previous 3 years. So it's been more than 3 years since you taught this course. You are given in that situation a 0.85 factor, which would result in 2.55 prep hours per week for a 3-hour week course. An established B, which is probably the most common for faculty who have been around for more than 2 or 3 years. This is a course that you've taught before and within the previous 3 academic years. You are given a factor of 0.6. So for a 3-hour course, you end up with 1.8 prep hours per week. Now, in some cases, we repeat the same course. We are given 2 different sections of the same course. And this is where these repeat categories come into play. So if we're given a repeat A, this is the same course. However, it is taught to students in a different program or a different year of study. And in that case, you're given a 0.45 attribution, which would result in a 1.35 prep hours per week for a 3-hour a week course. Probably more common is the repeat B situation, where you are teaching the same course to students in the same program and the same year of study. So in other words, there are 100 students in a program. You can't fit them all into one course, or you shouldn't, or one section. So they are split into 2, 3, maybe 4 sections. You would have one established attribution and then a series of repeat B for the additional sections of that same course. So limits that are defined around course preparations. There's a distinction between a preparation, a course prep, and a course section. So a course prep means a different subject matter, a different course. So you should not be given, or you cannot be compelled to accept, more than 4 different course preparations in a given SWFted period. Now you can be asked to accept more than that, and you have to agree to do so. Now they often have this caveat that you shall not unreasonably withhold your agreement. What is unreasonable is a matter of discussion, of course. But with no more than 4 preparations, you can accept more than that. However, I would caution you, your union would caution you to be sure before you accept more than 4. It can be very quickly overwhelming to have 5 or 6 different courses to prepare for. So we just caution you to make sure if you're going to accept more than the 4, make sure that you're able to handle those throughout the semester. So given those limits and given those factors, what should you do when you receive your SWF to check that the prep factors are accurate? Well, you want to check each one of your sections and course preps that you've been assigned. Make sure that they have the proper factor. So as we said, the new factor may be a subject for discussion between you and your supervisor. The others should be fairly straightforward. Did you teach that course in the last 3 years? Yes or no? That would distinguish between the established A or B. And then are you repeating this to the same group of students in the same year and program or whatever? So it's fairly straightforward. So it's just a matter of ensuring that it's accurate where it's presented on your SWF. So that's what you want to do. Once you receive your SWF, this is where you will see these prep factors attributed. So you can see here that we have the hours per section listed, which we already looked at. And then in the middle here, we now have this prep factor. So you can see that there is an established B, a repeat B, and then 2 other established B sections. And they have their factor here, which then multiplies by the teaching contact hours for that course. So we have 2 times 0.6 gives us 1.2 teaching preparation hours for that particular section, and so forth. And those all add up. In this case, adds up to 4.9 hours per week of prep. The third factor that comes into play in establishing your total workload is the attributed hours for evaluation and feedback. So this involves reviewing, marking tests and assignments, writing feedback to your students, individual feedback to your individual students based on those tests and assignments. So evaluation, much like prep, is based on a factor. However, there's a lot more of a sliding scale and room for negotiation with this evaluation factor as presented in the collective agreement. So every course or section that's listed on your SWF document needs to have associated with it an appropriate evaluation factor. Hours for evaluation and feedback for each course and section are determined by the following formula. You take the evaluation factor itself, which we'll look at in a few moments, multiply that by the number of teaching contact hours again, and this is also multiplied by the number of students, which of course makes sense because the more students you have, the more time you need to spend on evaluation and feedback. So the collective agreement defines 3 separate types of evaluation factors or types of evaluations that can be done in a course. The highest factor of 0.03 per teaching contact hour per student is for essay or project type evaluations. Then they define something called routine or assisted, which has half of that prep factor. And then still lower again is what they call an in-process evaluation factor. So we'll look at the definitions of each of these and see how these get combined or grouped into a kind of a combination evaluation factor for a given course. So for essay or project, the highest evaluation factor, this is not strictly an essay. This is any type of assessment that needs to be reviewed outside of class time and that has to be reviewed by an expert in that domain. So an essay certainly qualifies if a student is writing a report or an essay or any type of other written document and they submit that to their professor. The professor has to read that, go through it, make sure that it meets the criteria or how well it meets the criteria and assign a grade and give some written or verbal or recorded feedback to the student as a result of that. So that's a very time-consuming process, and that's why it has the highest evaluation factor attribution. Most of our assessments that we do and in post-secondary, well, at the college, will fall into this category. This is not only for English teachers. This is for any type of work that needs to be reviewed using your expertise outside of class time. Routine or assisted now is still assess or evaluation and review that's done outside of the class time, but now it is more, they use the term short answer tests, and by that they really mean automated tests like multiple choice, that type of thing, where the grading can be done automatically, right, when the answers are built into the test itself. And that's what they're talking about with mechanical marking assistant, or this mythical marking assistance that I don't think anybody has at Northern College. So if you give, some automated quizzes as part of your course, then those would factor in and would have a lower evaluation factor than essay or project type evaluations. In process is any type of evaluation that is performed within the teaching contact hour. So one example may be if you have to evaluate the students in a lab setting based on their adherence to safety protocols, for example, and there's a certain amount of the course that, there's a percentage of the course mark that is associated with that. So during a lab, you're walking around, monitoring the students, and as you're providing assistance and instruction to them, you're also noting their adherence to these safety protocols and evaluating that. Well, this is done in process. This is done during the teaching contact time, and so it has the lowest evaluation factor attributed to it. So to determine this, there can be obviously some dispute and some discussion that will go into what an appropriate evaluation factor for a given course should be. So what the collective agreement contemplates is that it recognizes that most courses will not have only a single type of evaluation that falls neatly into one of those three categories we just saw, that most courses will have some blending of these types of evaluations, and so it allows the flexibility of assigning a proportionate evaluation factor, one that combines from these three different categories. So you can discuss this with your supervisor, and you can say, this course is entirely project-based or entirely essay-based, or you can come to an agreement, or you can discuss with your supervisor what the proper evaluation factor should be. Now, if you're not able to come to agreement on this, there is a fallback whereby you can look at the evaluation, the course grading scheme, and based on your course grading scheme, if you have 60% of your course for long form tests or projects, 20% for automated quizzes, and 10% for in-class participation, whatever it may be, then that could result in a breakdown, between the maximum factor and some in process, possibly. So if you can't come to agreement with your supervisor, that would be the fallback, would be to look at the course grading scheme to kind of evaluate a proper proportion. Now, at Northern College, there seems to be a pretty standard approach here for assigning evaluation factors. And it's not really an area that you end up discussing that much necessarily, at least not to that detail that we just saw in the previous examples or previous slides. So at Northern, they use these kind of shorthands, E100, E75, E50. There may be an E25. I'm not exactly sure how far down the list they go with this. But they use this shorthand. So E100 means full maximum evaluation factor applied to this course, and no questions asked. So 0.03 will be multiplied by the number of students, by the number of contact hours, and that will be your evaluation factor. An E50, which seems like it's halfway between half of E100, is not it doesn't correspond exactly to that the middle evaluation factor as specified in the collective agreement. It actually has a proportionate factor of 0.0225. So Northern has kind of established their own set factors, and that tends to be what the supervisors tend to go with, is just these attributions that have been kind of established over a number of years. That doesn't mean they have to stay with those numbers, but to be honest, they are fairly high. You can see that this E50 is still higher than the middle attribution that's contemplated in the collective agreement. So be careful. I'm not saying don't question it. Absolutely. If you feel that it's not high enough, you can question it. Just be careful. Understand exactly what's meant by these factors that they're using on our SWFs. So when it comes to verifying your evaluation checklist or your evaluation factors on your SWF, you want to make sure, really think about the way you're evaluating students in each one of the courses that is listed on your SWF, and then look at the evaluation factor that's being attributed to that. Make sure that it meets, that you feel that it's giving you a fair factor, a fair evaluation factor for that course. The number of students also comes into play now, which it did not with the prep factor. So you want to make sure that the number of students is accurate. Now, when you first get your SWF, it has to be estimated because they don't know for sure how many students will be in your course 6 or 7 weeks down the road. However, you should have a fairly good idea. So it should be a reasonable estimate at that stage. And then this needs to be reviewed as we do every semester. By the audit date, we review the number of students in our courses to make sure that when you receive your revised SWF, that number is accurate according to who's actually attending your course. If you have some question, maybe you're not sure what kind of time you're spending on evaluations, well, you can certainly start monitoring this throughout the semester as you're doing marking tests and marking essays and all the other things that you're doing for your course. Keep track of how much time you're spending, and then look at what's attributed on your SWF and see if it's not sufficient. Maybe you need to talk to your supervisor about that the next time you were given that course. It's also a very good idea to compare if you have other faculty who are teaching the same course, even if in another program, which can often happen. It's a good idea to compare how you've been attributed evaluation factors for that course on your SWF and compare with them. They should be the same in most cases, unless the course is being taught very differently between two different faculty. So on your actual SWF, what does this look like? We now have 3 sections highlighted. We still have the hours, teaching contact hours highlighted, but now we also indicate the class size, which comes into play. So the teaching contact hours times the number of students times the evaluation factor gives you the evaluation time that you have for that course. Now this is a weekly attribution, right? So for this first course, I'm given 1.56 hours per week for this course. So keep in mind when you're thinking about how much time you're spending on evaluation that you're not necessarily spending time every single week doing evaluation for every single course. So you want to factor that in, that this is an average. And if I'm given 6 hours a week for evaluation, as I am here, does that average out to a fair attribution for the time I'm spending evaluating my students? That's what you need to modify or monitor and pay attention to throughout the semester. So finally, the final category we're going to look at today is complementary functions. So a complementary function is something that is assigned to you as part of your assigned workload for the semester. And it is work that is appropriate to the professional role of the teacher. And this should be attributed on your SWF on an hour-for-hour basis. So, in other words, appropriate to the professional role of the teacher, you probably know, what is and is not appropriate. To use a silly example, you can, if you're asked to sanitize bathrooms in between your course prep or your teaching of courses at the college, that's probably not appropriate to your role. So the important thing here is this idea that this work should be attributed on your SWF. And this is often this is often an area of dispute between your manager and yourself. Before we get into that, we'll discuss the areas that is not up for dispute. You are allowed a minimum of 6 hours of complementary functions on your SWF, and that is what you are entitled to. That is not disputable. So the 6 hours is supposed to be attributed in this way: 4 hours for routine out-of-class assistance to individual students, and 2 hours for normal administrative tasks. Now, please keep in mind that this does not correspond to office hours. You can certainly set up scheduled office hours yourself if that's what you choose to do, but this 4 hours does not mean that you need to block off 4 hours on your timetable every week when you are going to be available to students. It means that they are giving you 4 hours per week where you should be doing routine out of class assistance to individual students, which could mean answering emails, answering questions after class. Often we'll stick around 10, 15 minutes after class. All of these things add up, and that's what's being contemplated like with that. And of course, if your student requests to meet with you for an hour in a given week for assistance, that would fall under this as well. 2 hours for normal administrative tasks. These are tasks that are as a result of your teaching assignment. Okay, so what I want to emphasize with this section is these words here, routine and normal. All right, so all of this work comes directly out of the work that is associated with the courses you've been assigned. The out-of-class assistance to students and the administrative tasks are routine and normal based on those courses that you've been assigned. So what type of work can be added on top of that? So those 6 hours are to cover that kind of routine and normal work that comes with the courses. And then on top of that, you can be given time to do all kinds of things that are appropriate to your role. Attending regular meetings, being part of a committee, doing curriculum development for a course. If you're a coordinator, that has a time allotment assigned to it as well. Setting up labs, working with special needs students. There are all kinds of things. We have seen all kinds of things associated with or given listed as complementary functions on a SWF. The bottom line is that if you are directed to do something outside of the routine or normal functions that result from your assigned courses, that should be recorded on your SWF as a complementary function in addition to those 6 hours that you're given for complementary functions. So what do you do for your comp functions checklist? Think about the work you're doing through the semester. Think about what your supervisor has asked you to do on that SWF, and make sure that it is indicated in some way on that second page where they detail the complementary functions. Now, it often happens that we are asked to do new things or different things during the semester. We are already 2 weeks into our SWF period, and we get asked to do something. As an example, we'd like you to join this new committee that's formed. It's going to meet once or twice a month, and we'd like you to be a part of that. Well, this is new work. This is outside of that routine, normal work that comes along with the courses you've been assigned. And so your supervisor, together with asking you to do this, should be issuing you a new SWF with an appropriate time allotment to recognize the work that you're being asked to do. We often see some eye rolling when we emphasize this, with whether it be with other faculty or with management. And I understand where it comes from. People think that, oh, you're just complaining, you're just trying to get every minute tracked, on your SWF for everything that you're being asked to do. Well, that's partly true. And there's a reason for that, because if you do not track this, if you do not attribute this time, this work that you're being asked to do, if it's not recorded, well, it can easily snowball. And we see it all the time where people get asked to do something, asked to do another thing, and then a third or fourth thing. Before you know it, you've got an additional 10 hours a week you're trying to juggle or manage and fit in somewhere on top of the work you were already doing. It is important that you keep track of this and that your manager properly attribute the work that he's asking you to do or she's asking you to do, and that should be showing on your SWF. So complementary functions show up in this last column. The minimum 6 hours everybody should have, and that should be sitting here under this allowance column. And then this final category is the assigned, the additional complementary functions that get assigned to you, and that number can vary greatly depending on what type of role an individual faculty member has at the college, whether they're a coordinator, whether they have involvement on committees or union duties and that sort of thing. Now, we talked about some of the limits that are applied or that are expressed within Article 11. You are allowed to go beyond those limits. You can do overtime, but that is also limited. So you can have one additional teaching contact hour, which would mean 19 for post-secondary and 21 hours for non-post-secondary, or you can have a maximum of 3 total workload hours for a maximum of 47 total workload hours per week. So overtime is voluntary. You can't be compelled to do it. You can, but you do always have to have a reason for denying overtime. And if you do accept overtime, it's compensated at an hourly rate of 0.1% of your annual salary. As a quick calculation, if your annual salary is $80,000 a year, 0.1% of that is $80. So it would be $80 an hour times the number of hours per week of overtime times the number of weeks on your SWF. So when you do receive your SWF, you have 5 days to review it, and you can either accept it or refer it onto the workload monitoring group. Now, faculty are often a little bit leery of doing this referral to WMG. If you have concerns or questions about your SWF, about your workload as detailed on the SWF, you can just reach out to your supervisor informally and express these concerns, and you may be able to resolve this in a fairly quick manner. However, there is nothing wrong with checking this box, referred to workload monitoring group, signing it off that way and sending it back to your supervisor at the same time as you're trying to resolve it with them. What you don't want to have happen is try to discuss this with your supervisor. Meanwhile, these 5 days are ticking away, because the college will, in fact, and often do say, no, it's too late. You can no longer dispute this SWF. 5 days have already passed. So while we're not discouraging anybody from having discussions with their supervisor to try and work this out, do be aware of that 5-day limit. And if you're not getting a response from your supervisor within that time period, just send this back so that you're covering yourself, so that you're not allowing this SWF to expire or to be deemed accepted after those 5 days have passed. So that's the overview. Hopefully that gives you the key information that you need to properly review your SWF. If you have questions, many of you probably will, when you review your SWF, please reach out to a union steward. They can give you lots of advice and feedback. And if they don't know the answer to something that you're asking about, they will refer you to another steward who probably will. Take some time to read through Article 11 when you can, as you can. The more familiar you get with it, the more empowered you will be in these SWF negotiations and discussions with your supervisor. And please do check in regularly at our website, 653.ca, where we post resources. There's lots of information up there already. This video is up here along with the PowerPoint slides. And we will continue to put information up there that relates to your workload, as well as many other things that relate to your job as faculty at Northern College. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.